Good afternoon, everybody. Can I just have someone give a shout out to say they can both hear me and see the slides, please?
Yeah, so far so good, I think.
Yes,
Right.
I can. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thanks, Ash. Okay, so it's time to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. It's a bit unusual to be doing a talk in this format. I'm used to giving them in front of audiences and being able to see people's reactions. So it's a little bit more difficult on Zoom, but we'll persevere and get through it. So thank you all for coming. If you don't know me, my name is Bayden Russell. I'm an associate professor here at the Swire Institute of Marine Science at the University of Hong Kong. And I've been in Hong Kong for about 6 years now. And in that time, I've been one of the research avenues that I've been exploring and working on is oysters and oysters in the Hong Kong area. So that's a bit of what I'll talk about today, is that component of the research that I do. So getting on with it. So as you may have gathered from the advertisement for the talk, if you ask people about oysters, and I've done this over the years, you say, well, what do you know about oysters? And their response is generally, well, you know, I like to eat them, or I don't like to eat them. You know, people tend to be one or the other. They do or they don't like to eat them. Those who like to eat oysters will invariably say, well, I like them fresh with a bit of lemon, maybe oysters Kilpatrick. Locally in Hong Kong, people like golden oysters. That's a very big local delicacy. Some people, and the people who think that they're very educated in oysters, might say to you, well, where do you get your oysters from? You know, I get my oysters from France or Australia, or, you know, I get them locally. And so the discussion tends to be around where you get your oysters to eat. Right? So we're coming back to that eating of oysters again. Some people will talk to you about how they're harvested, right? So you can see some people will talk about things like bag culture along lines, or rope culture that we find in China and this part of the world, maybe basket and line culture, or even historically in Hong Kong, we've had this benthic form of aquaculture where we've had oysters on posts sticking out of the seabed. But again, all of that discussion is about how people eat oysters, how they're produced, how they're eaten. And that really does dominate the conversation about oysters. And it's unsurprising, really. I mean, oysters as a food source are extremely important globally. Certainly in this part of the region, they're very important. They're a very valuable product. About 4.5 million tons of oysters are produced globally every year. To put that in context, that's about the mass of 171,000 double-decker buses in Hong Kong. So it's 29 times more buses than we have, right? So that's a massive weight of oysters that's being produced every year. It's worth about $5 billion US every year. So the oyster aquaculture industry is actually a significant employer. It's worth a lot of money, and it feeds a lot of people, at least a percentage of the protein that they have every year. And importantly, 85% of that production is in China. And a lot of it comes from this southern China region. So it's no wonder that people talk about eating oysters. But it's actually not their only value. And what I've been working on with my collaborators over the last few years is looking at the value of oysters other than that production value, so what we grow them for. All right. And in fact, one of the things that we're discovering, one of the things that globally this research is showing, is that actually oysters might have more value in nature as a natural part of these coastal ecosystems that we rely on. So what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the talk is oyster reefs, right? And no one really, globally, people don't really know about oyster reefs. Right? And you can see that they are these structures. You can see on this top left-hand picture here, this is an intertidal oyster reef in the USA. You can see all of those oysters are making that complex 3D structure. They can be intertidal, so that they come out of the water when the tide goes out. They can be subtidal. So there's two examples of subtidal oyster reefs there. But the big thing about these oyster reefs is that they're complex structures. There's lots of room for animals to live. They have lots of different functions that they perform. Most people have heard of coral reefs. These oyster reefs perform very similar functions, but in more estuarine waters. And so you don't usually find oyster reefs and coral reefs together. And so you find that oyster reefs will form these functions in the often muddier estuarine waters. So if we're thinking about oyster reefs and what they do for, well, in this case, we're talking about humans, right? So we're talking about ecosystem services and what oyster reefs can do for humans and human society. And this is a really nice diagram that just kind of sums it up, I think, and gets to a lot of the points very quickly. The first thing that people are very interested in is that they provide shelter for other species. So we know that oyster reefs increase the biodiversity of other animals and algae that inhabit a certain area. So if you're thinking about where oyster reefs are, they tend to be places where if there's no reefs, it's muddy or sandy shores. And so by providing those that structured habitat, you actually provide this shelter for other organisms. One of the things that often gets people excited when they start to learn about this is that those other organisms are either things that we like to catch, so crabs and fish, or the food for those other species, so the food for the fish that we catch and eat. So not only do oyster reefs provide habitat directly for species, they actually provide food for the species that we then rely on. Something that's starting to come into very sharp relief as we start to understand climate change is how oyster reefs actually reduce wave energy. And so as a shoreline, they will protect things that we like to develop, our housing, our other infrastructure, by reducing wave energy. They stabilize the sediment, so that's sand or mud, and they filter the water so that other habitats like seagrasses, which are very important, will actually be able to regrow and form more habitat. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but they also reduce nutrients in the water and they filter the water, so they clean the water. So that's just a very quick overview of the sorts of things that oyster reefs will actually do that we rely on as humans. Right? These are things that we rely on. So I'm going to run through some of them in a little bit more detail, just to provide some evidence that you might follow up in the future, but it certainly gives you an indication of how important oyster reefs are. So one of the first ecosystem services that people focus on is fisheries production. We're starting to get some information from other parts of the world about how big the fisheries production can be for oyster reefs, or from oyster reefs. This is a graph that was published recently about the Gulf of Mexico, so oyster reefs in the Gulf of Mexico. And what it shows is how much fisheries production, so the weight of fisheries species in kilograms per hectare per year, and the number of years since oyster reefs were restored back into a place where they'd they'd been removed from. And what this work has clearly shown is that within 10 years of putting oyster reefs back where they've been removed from, and we'll get back to that concept a little bit later. In the Gulf of Mexico, these oyster reefs are producing 5 tons of fish per hectare per year. And we're using fish in a very broad term. That includes crabs, it includes several species of fish. But if you think about it, that's a lot of tonnage, that's a lot of fisheries production coming from quite a small area. If you want to put a dollar value on that, there's a really good case study that's coming out of the Eastern USA at the moment. And this comes from, if you can see on the map, it's the Eastern United States. It comes from just in Maryland, near Washington, DC. And we're talking about Harris Creek, which is this creek here that opens out into some bigger water. Harris Creek had oyster reef restoration, which was completed in 2015. And then 3 years later, they went back to see what the fisheries production was of that restored reef area after 3 years. So this is only 3 years worth of growth and development of these oyster reefs. And what they found was that after only 3 years, the extra fisheries production from that restoration was $22.8 million US dollars per year. And they're getting, in some species, they're getting up to 650% increase in catch. So if you think about it, yeah, it costs some money to do the restoration, but actually this was a really good investment for them, because they were getting just the fisheries production was worth nearly 23 million US dollars a year extra. And so this is not an insubstantial service that oyster reefs provide in just fisheries production. One of the most valuable services that these systems provide is because they form that extensive hard structure just where the waves are breaking. They protect shorelines. And so we're starting to realize that as climate change is heading forward into the future, we're getting increased frequency of storms, they're getting bigger. We're also getting sea level rise, so that the waters are coming higher. That means that waves are going to more and more threaten infrastructure and coastal development that we're doing around the world. And one of the things that has been demonstrated now is that if you have oyster reefs in front of a shoreline, it attenuates those waves, it drops those waves, brings that wave height down, and protects that area behind the oyster reef. Now, not only does that actually protect the shoreline itself, but it actually provides habitat for these other species. And so you can get marsh grasses, you can get other coastal habitats. It protects mangroves, for instance. And that increases those ecosystem services even more because you've got these extra habitats there. So more and more people are starting to understand that oyster reefs will be valuable for protecting human infrastructure. And this is actually possibly one of the most valuable resources that they'll provide, one of these services that they'll provide. As I mentioned, it protects these other habitats as well. So these behind the reef seagrasses and marshes and things like that. I really like this picture or diagram that the Nature Conservancy produced a few years ago, because it shows that it's not just an absolute, right? So it's not just that putting oyster reefs in will protect what's behind them from waves and wave height. It shows that it's actually a compounding effect. So if you look at this bottom figure here, you can see there's a little bit of oyster reef, but not much, or maybe in some situations it would be just mudflat. That means that there's very little vegetation or other habitats behind the reefs further inshore, which means that there's almost no attenuation of waves as they come in. If, however, you have these highly structured reefs, it protects more space for habitat. You get these other habitats in the back, behind the reefs, and that actually attenuates the waves even more. And so you get this compounding effect of that protection by having those reefs there. So it's not just the value that the reefs are performing themselves, but also that flow-on effect through multiple other types of habitats. And if we're thinking about this in the local context, because I always like to try and bring it back to the local context, we saw quite spectacularly in 2018 when Typhoon Mangkhut came through, that if you have hard structures, if you have concrete walls or concrete slopes without anything to sort of slow the waves down, then you can have some pretty spectacular effects happening. If you had oyster reefs in front of these walls, those waves are actually slowed down before they hit the walls, so they don't just crash straight up over these concrete walls like we saw in Typhoon Mangkhut. So even though we're developing these shorelines, and we'll continue to do it, let's be honest, we'll continue to develop coastlines. If you can put some of these natural habitats in front of those developments, you can actually protect the developments, you can protect the infrastructure, and reduce some of those impacts. And if we're looking at the value of oyster reefs, this is one of the really big value points, because you're protecting very expensive infrastructure. We recently looked at the effect of oysters in Hong Kong on filtering water, or how they filter water and how effective they are. And we were really surprised. What we found is that they actually filter water possibly more rapidly than most oysters in the world. So this is a video, just a little video that we did in the lab, and we were looking at the filtration rates. At summer temperatures, so at water temperatures approaching 30 degrees, we found that just 7 square meters of Hong Kong oysters can filter roughly the volume of an Olympic swimming pool every day, right? So over a 24-hour period. And that's pretty extraordinary when you think about how much water volume that is that these oysters are cleaning. I really like this video because a lot of videos you see them zoomed out and you don't get the detail, but in this one you can really see the oysters, how they actually do move quite a bit, but you can really see them actively filtering. You can even see some of the mucus chains and deposition that they're doing as well when they're filtering the water clean. So it's really quite fun to have done this and understand how well Hong Kong oysters can actually filter our waters. We're not at this stage yet, but around the world, people are trying to measure these rates in the wild, so actually going out and measuring them in the ocean. And this is one experiment that they did in the USA. And so you can see here, there's a piece of equipment here, and the water is flowing from right to left, and there's another piece of equipment here. And literally what these pieces of equipment are doing is measuring the suspended particles in the water at that point, and then the suspended particles in the water at that point, and the difference is how much the oysters have filtered out along the way. And in between here is an oyster reef. And if you look at that effect, you can see quite clearly this is the amount of material in the water over time, and you can see quite clearly the difference between those two pieces of equipment shows that the oyster reefs really do filter the water, and not just in a lab setting, but we can actually measure it in the field. So this is a real effect, and it can be quite large. Something that goes along with that filtration, goes hand in hand, and I won't go into the detail because it's actually quite a complex process, and it really is very complicated, the way all the different bits work, and they work differently in different places as well, is denitrification. And it's taking nutrients, particularly nitrogen, out of the water. The big part that
people need to understand about how that happens is that what oysters do is they filter microalgae that's floating around in the water. They filter them out to eat them. Right? So they're just eating, and all of the water, as they're doing that, they're also filtering other particles out of the water, and all of that material gets deposited into the sediment. So they're cleaning the water, depositing that material into the mud or the sand, and then it's broken down through bacterial processing. And that means that there's less nutrients in the water. So as an ecosystem service, that's really good, because where does so much of our waste go? Into the ocean. So after we treat sewage, we pump it, what's left, into the ocean. Right? If you've got functional oyster reefs, they have a big role in actually treating water and cleaning it up. So this is, again, one of those really big services that oyster reefs and healthy, intact oyster reefs can play for humans. Locally speaking, this is something that we really need to be concerned about, because this is just a couple of photos of harmful algal blooms or toxic blooms in Hong Kong. Every year now you see these blooms coming along. You can see that they're getting more extensive, they're happening more frequently. ASCD is tracking them to understand where they are. Beaches sometimes will have to be shut because of them. So this is becoming a big problem, and that's because of eutrophication, so nutrient pollution in the waters. If we had more oyster reefs and less pollution, then harmful algal blooms would likely go away. And so this is one potential way that we can think about trying to mitigate some of these issues that we have in places like Hong Kong. It's not limited to Hong Kong, but Hong Kong does have some of these nutrient issues or eutrophication problems. So that's a really quick run through of some of, not all of, but some of the ecosystem services that oysters provide for humans. We started right at the start talking about aquaculture and production of oysters, and that being worth about $5 billion US per year globally. If you look at these oyster reef values, excluding the cost, excluding any harvesting, so excluding any money that you can make from harvesting oysters, the estimates are that oyster reefs, an intact oyster reef, can provide up to $99,000 US per hectare per year in value. So it's nearly $100,000 US, or nearly 800,000 Hong Kong dollars per hectare per year. To put that into context, a rugby or a soccer pitch is about a hectare. And so if you restore these habitats and have intact oyster reefs in the coastal environment, for every hectare that you have, they're providing anywhere up to $100,000 US worth of value to humans every year. And that's through nutrient cycling and water filtration and fisheries production and coastal protection. All of those things together builds to that value. If you think about how much area globally across the historical distribution of oyster reefs, that value is much, much more than the $5 billion that comes from farming oysters. And so actually, oyster reefs, left intact, are more valuable to us by far. Right? So everyone should be talking about oyster reefs. It's fine to eat oysters, and certainly it should be part of the conversation, but actually we should be talking much more about oyster reefs. So if we should be talking about them, why aren't we? Why don't people know about oysters? Right? There's this investment there that we could make, so why don't people talk about oyster reefs? The reason is that over 85% of oyster reefs have been lost globally, and that's actually an underestimate. If you look at this figure here, this is an estimate of oyster reef health that was done a bit over a decade ago now. It was a global assessment that was done. Everything from being in good condition, and you'll note there's not many that are in good condition, through to functionally extinct. What's quite clear is in most of the places in the world that they did these assessments, the oyster reefs were either poor or functionally extinct. What you note though is that there's no information from this entire region here through East, South and Southeast Asia. Now, just because there's not a color on the map, there doesn't mean that we've got good quality oyster reefs. What it means is that there was no information to assess. And so this 85% is actually likely to be an underestimate. Right? So we know where the assessment's been done, 85% have been lost, but actually it's probably more than that. To put that into context, coral reefs, depending on assessment, about 20 to 30% have been lost globally. Mangroves about 50%. So this kind of puts oyster reefs in the most endangered marine habitat category. All right, so globally, they're actually more in trouble than any other habitat. So why don't we know about that? All right, so there's a lot of talk about loss of coral reefs. There's a lot of talk about loss of mangroves. Why not the talk about the loss of oyster reefs? Quite frankly, because most of it was more than 100 years ago. And if you think about that, that leads to something that we call the shifting baseline syndrome. Right? What that means is that we have a perception of natural that is completely different to our grandparents, or parents, grandparents, and their parents. So what I think of it as a natural shoreline is vastly different to what my grandparents would have seen as a natural shoreline. And that goes on generation after generation to the point where we've actually forgotten that oyster reefs exist in a lot of these places. Examples that we have from around the world of different shifting baselines. Just a couple of examples. Here we have in the 1950s and early 2000s fishing in Florida. And you can see quite clearly that the fish in the 1950s were much bigger. They were catching many more than the average catch in the early 2000s. Right? So we're talking about 44 pounds, so about 20 kilograms worth of a catch versus 5 pounds, which is a bit over 2 kilograms. So that's a massive shifting baseline, because people would be quite happy with that as a catch these days, when actually it's really quite reduced. In the Florida Keys, you might have been diving in the 1980s, and that's what a coral reef would have looked like. What does it look like now? Completely degraded, barely any coral, a completely different system. So that's the shifting baseline. If you started diving there now, that's what you would think of as natural. But it's not just these natural systems that we're talking about, and fisheries catch or coral reefs, those sorts of things. It's also coastlines and development. I really like this photo. This is a photo of Hong Kong looking down from the peak, and so that's obviously Victoria Harbour in the background, and Central in the foreground. So in the 1930s, that's what it looked like, and obviously we all know what it looks like now. So obviously, that's a massive baseline shift when you think about how much reclamation and shoreline movement there has been, and all of those marine habitats that would have been lost from that reclamation and development. So what's happened to oyster reefs in Hong Kong? I think that some of that answer will be pretty obvious to you, but some of it maybe not. The largest impact and removal of oysters in Hong Kong happened to be for harvesting for lime for the shells. And most of that happened as much as, or as long ago as the 7th century. Right? So 7th through the 10th century, there was a massive harvest of shells in the Pearl River Delta area for lime. Right? So these shells were harvested burnt in lime kilns and then used for anything from building materials, which was a very big thing, through to boat caulking, agricultural fertilizer, improvement of land, those sorts of things. This picture on the left I really like because, well, I think it's a fascinating photo. It's not a good photo, but it's fascinating to think that that pile there is a pile of oyster shells, right? And that's the size of a person sitting on top. So this is actually the scale of the harvesting that happened. And then through the 19th and 20th century, there was this sort of increase or revitalization of the lime industry, and that was through dredging of oyster shells as well, for production of lime. So this production, or this harvesting through the production of lime, has been going on for centuries. If we think about shifting baselines, it's no wonder then that we don't recognize that oyster reefs used to be in Hong Kong. There's also immense fishing pressure that is still happening. Any weekend you go out to anywhere where there are the oysters, and they'll be getting harvested. And so we know now that most of the oysters in the shorelines of Hong Kong are no older than around 1 to 2 years, and that's because that's when they get big enough to eat. And so harvesting pressure here is really high. The problem with that is that it means that oyster reefs can't recover. Oyster reefs need shells or rocks to grow on. That's how the structure forms. If you remove the shells, if you take the oysters away, then there's no substrate for them for the juveniles to settle on and grow. Obviously, reclamation and shoreline development is a massive thing, all right? Because oyster reefs tend to be fairly close to shore. Right. And so as we develop these areas, as we have this reclamation happening, we destroy that habitat. And so this is just one example, obviously, that's playing in the background, and that's the development of the airport. And you can see all of that development along northern Lantau coastlines that goes with it. So there are a couple of the big things that's happened in Hong Kong. What's the answer? Well, we know that at least 85% of oyster reefs have been lost globally. Right? So these habitats have been removed by harvesting and damage. This means that all of those functions that these oyster reefs perform and all of the services that they provide for humans are now gone. Right? So we know that this has happened. So what do we do? And the big thing is restoration. If we want those functions and services back, we have to give nature a hand and help restore these oyster reefs. Globally, oyster reef restoration has started to become a big thing. It's becoming really quite common in the last couple of decades. In the USA, since I'm pretty sure this map is from projects since 2001, and it's about 170 projects, and you can see the sites all up and down the east and a lot in the west coast as well. Right? So there's 170 places where they're doing oyster reef restoration in the USA. There's a lot of really good evidence coming out of the US about how much of those services is brought back. Australia and New Zealand have more recently started restorations. They've got 9 or 10 different projects running at the moment, but they've started quite extensively as well. So a lot of their projects are really quite large, hectares in size. And so there's a lot of restoration activity going on there, and they're finding a lot of information coming out on how good restoration of oyster reefs is as far as providing fisheries production. So that's really exciting. And Europe and the UK, there are more and more projects starting up recently, so the last 5 years or so. I really like this map, just as a sort of side point. This is an old map of where oyster habitats used to be. They know that they used to be in through this region. So any of that brown shaded area
used to be oyster reef. And so actually oyster reefs were very, very extensive throughout Europe, the coastal areas of Europe and the UK. And so they've now got these maps to be able to start to know where to put this restoration effort in. So that's actually a very important first step. In China, not much. This is something that's only just starting. There are a couple of places. There are more in planning, but there are currently only a couple of examples from China. So it's very, very new, very, very new here. But what about Hong Kong? Right, so I've spoken a lot about loss, and I've spoken a lot about the sort of the global context. But what about Hong Kong? Well, we're right at the start in Hong Kong. So I'll run you through some of the work that I've been doing with the Nature Conservancy, just to show you where we've progressed through, or what we've progressed through in Hong Kong, and what the next steps are. So the first thing that we had to do is we actually had to find out where oyster reefs might have been in Hong Kong. And this is actually really quite difficult because obviously they're gone. So we know that we have to find where they are, because there's no point in trying to do restoration in places where these habitats didn't used to exist. And so we've actually put quite a bit of effort going through old documents, historical documents and charts to find out where oyster reefs may have been. And all of these oyster symbols on the map show where places that we know from these documents that there were oyster reefs. And so you can see actually both sides of Hong Kong, east and west, oyster reefs were actually quite common and quite extensive. The other interesting thing about this map is you can also see those pink areas are land reclamation and development. And you'll note that there's actually quite a bit of overlap between areas that have been developed and reclaimed and where oyster reefs used to be. And so obviously, we need to think about how you can restore or put these reefs back adjacent to those developments. The second thing we had to go on and do was surveys of oysters and their populations around Hong Kong. This map shows you some of the surveys, or the more extensive surveys that we've done. We've done a lot around Lantau Island and Deep Bay. Those blue stars are where there's active aquaculture, and so there's sources of oysters there for the juveniles. And we're expanding the number of sites in the east, and slowly but surely trying to understand where these habitats are and what their state is. What we can say from these surveys is that there aren't any oyster reefs left, well, at least not that we've found, but there are oyster habitats. And so there are oysters there, but they're too spread out to form reefs. So they can't form those consolidated reef structures at this point. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are very few oysters that we're finding that are more than a couple of years old, because once they get to a couple of years old, they're harvested. And so that's one of the things that we really need to look at when we're thinking about restoration, is how do we protect these reefs as they form so that they can perform these functions. The third thing that you really need to know when you're thinking about restoration is whether there's a source of baby oysters, right? So you need to know whether there's any oysters natural recruitment sources. So a couple of years ago, we actually did some recruitment trials, and the answer is in Hong Kong, yes. There are a lot of oysters, or at least baby oysters in the water column in the season that they spawn. And we found that we were getting up to 100,000 baby oysters settling per square meter of space. So if you give them the space, they can come and settle. So what we did was we put these recruitment tiles out, and so these are the tiles here on some frames, and we put these in places that we know there used to be oysters historically, and after only 8 months, so that same year, we had masses of oysters growing there.
so these oysters really can recruit and can grow. They need the substrate to do that. So it can't just be sand, it has to be the right type of substrate, and the best is oyster shells. So we know historically where these things are. We know where there is still some oyster habitat, and we know that we can get the recruitment. So we started to look at some of these services, and I've already mentioned this filtration, and that in Hong Kong we get really high filtration rates, especially in summer. So we know that they can actually filter lots of water and do that job. More recently, we've been looking at pilots for restoration. So we've done a couple of different pilot runs in both the West and the East. And overall, what we're finding is that if you can provide this consolidated habitat, if you can get this reef habitat or close to it, you definitely increase the biodiversity. Depending on how long that the reef structure's been there and how extensive it is, we've got at least 3, 4, 5 times the biodiversity on these reefs. And importantly, in our plots that we've done these trials, almost 60% of the species that we find on those oyster reef habitats are only found there and not on the mud shore, which is next to it. And so that means that we are increasing local diversity and local biomass. Right, we found that there were at least 6 times greater biomass of other animals on the reef. Okay, and that doesn't include the oysters themselves. And so this is just other things that are living there, right? We're providing that living habitat for these other organisms. And these are things that we as humans care about. You know, crabs, we saw lots of fish, even some more charismatic species. We found nudibranchs, we found sea urchins. There was lots of stuff depending on which reefs we're talking about, which side of Hong Kong. And so we think that this is possible. We've got the baby oysters in the water. If we provide them the habitat to settle on, we do get this increased recruitment, and then over time we do actually get this increased biodiversity and filtration. So that's actually really quite exciting. We are very excited about where that's going in Hong Kong. We know that these oyster reefs will provide these ecosystem services, and that they were extensive in Hong Kong, right? And we've had these successful trials. What we need to do next is actually implement this restoration over larger scales, because only by doing that can we bring back oyster reefs and the ecosystems that are and the services that are associated with them. Now, one point that I do have to make, because it's a question that is always asked, is, well, do you want to make all our shores oyster reefs? And the answer is no, because one of the big things that came out of our our pilot trials is that the biggest benefit that you can have is shores that have a mix of habitats. And so what you need to be doing is having oyster reefs as part of a bigger mosaic, which has oyster reefs and mud shores and sandy shores and your seagrasses and all of these other things. And so by actually bringing oyster reefs back, you can have these other shores, you can have the biodiversity that's associated with them, as well as all of the benefits of oyster reefs. And so that's what we're looking at now, and that's what our next step is. So I'd just like to finish by saying, well, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. I need to thank all of the volunteers and staff that have worked on the projects. I mean, what I talked about just then is about 5 or 6 years worth of work, and a lot of people have worked on it, too many to name individually. I really have to thank the Nature Conservancy. They've been brilliant partners in this research and the work we're doing. In particular, Maureen Thomas and Bose Hancock. They've put unending energy towards this, and bringing their expertise and energy towards and passion towards reef restoration has been fantastic. Also, AFCD, brilliant conversations and support and guidance over the years, and so really have to thank them, and also the ECF, the Environmental Conservation Fund, for funding some of this work as we're going through, because obviously, you know, we need the support to actually do the science. So I'll leave it there and say thank you, and I will take questions if I can figure out how, unless someone else wants to drive it. Are there any questions? Okay, so I'm trying to scroll through where we're at the Q&A. Okay, so the first question that I've got here is, can the oysters be consumed after being used for filtration? Will they be contaminated? So some of that will come down to the water they're filtering. And I know that there's a lot of work that's going into establishing depuration. So depuration is cleaning oysters before they're sent off to be eaten by humans. There's a lot of work going into making sure that those processes are sufficient to actually make oysters safe to eat. And so that's actually it's a very big focus of the aquaculture industry, because, you know, they know exactly where their oysters have been, and so they do that. From the perspective of oyster reefs, the best thing you can do is leave the oysters there. So we don't actually want to harvest and eat the oysters from oyster reefs, because the functions that they perform are so much more than just providing food. If we leave them there, they'll actually provide us with more fish and more crabs and all these other things that we can eat anyway. So actually, the best thing to do is leave oyster reefs intact. So there's quite a big difference between aquaculture, which is production for food specifically, and restoration of these natural habitats. There's another question about what can we do individually. A big thing that we can do individually is to actually try and talk to people and get the message out there. One of the most effective ways that oyster reef restoration has been developed in other countries is actually through community action. And so, for instance, in Australia, it was the recreational fishing people, their community, their recreational fishing organisations, which really pushed the government to say, look, if we do oyster reef restoration, there will be so many more fish, and this is the money that the community and the government will make out of it, because people go out, they hire boats, they buy fishing equipment, they, you know, do all of these things. And so as a community, as a public, supporting the restoration and talking to the government and government agencies and saying, hey, this is a really important thing. We really want to clean up our oceans. We really want to support our fisheries. That community action will actually start to get some momentum and push us forward and really help out. There's a follow-on question from the filtration question, which is, is the function of filtering water different in different seasons? The short answer is yes. So oysters, because they're invertebrates, they can't control their body temperature. And so their metabolism, the speed of their metabolism is controlled by the environmental temperature. So in winter, when it's colder, they'll by definition have a lower metabolism, they do everything slower. They'll filter at lower rates than they will in summer when the temperature is much higher. The interesting thing is, if you think about Hong Kong and the system here, there's actually more runoff from land and rivers during summer when it's raining, when it's hotter, than there is in winter. And so when there's more stuff running into the ocean from the land in summer, that's when the oysters are actually more efficient and faster at filtering. So yes, they will filter slower in winter, but actually they really need to be faster in summer anyway. And so from a system perspective, that's really quite good. Over a year, they still have quite high filtration rates, and they still perform that function all year, even though it's slightly slower in winter. Are there any other questions? I'm just looking at the chat. Can't see anything else. Last questions? Oh, hang on. We've got another question. So the question is how we restore oyster reefs. Do we put baby oysters in the target place, or do you put things out there for the baby oysters to grow on? The answer to that depends on whether there are naturally baby oysters in the water. So whether you've got populations of adult oysters which will produce those babies, and then you get natural recruitment. We're lucky in Hong Kong that in most of Hong Kong, the places that we've surveyed so far at least, we get a lot of oysters in the recruitment season. And so, you know, around May every year, there will be a lot of baby oysters in the water column looking for somewhere to settle and live. So what we've been doing so far is putting out the hard substrate. The best substrate you can put down for oysters to settle on is oyster shells. The baby oysters naturally will queue in and find oyster shells. And so what we're focusing on now is putting some sort of hard substrate down. And so limestone tends to work really well because it's calcium carbonate, it's closer to the oyster shells. And then you put oyster shells on top of that, and that acts as somewhere for the oysters to settle and grow and then form those reefs. In places in the world where those oysters are completely gone, and so there's no oysters left, what they have to do is they actually have to pre-seed oyster shells or pre-seed concrete with oyster shells on them and put them out into the wild with those baby oysters on them. And so there are places in the USA, for instance, where what they've had to do is put oyster shells in an aquaculture farm in the hatchery, get baby oysters on them, and then put them out. And that's actually the Harris Creek example that I showed. That's actually what they had to do there. And I can't remember the exact number, but I think it was they put about 2 billion baby oysters on oyster shells in a hatchery and then put them out into the wild. So the answer to your question is it depends on where you are. In Hong Kong, we're lucky. We've got those natural oysters out there. So we just need to use that as a source. Other places in the world, they're not so lucky, and they actually have to produce them in the hatcheries and then put them out into the wild. Any more questions? We've got a couple of minutes left. No. I think that's it for the questions. Again, thank you everybody for coming along. It's always fun to talk about the work we're doing and talk about the future of oysters and restoration in Hong Kong. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Please feel free to come and join us on any of our Nature Conservancy activities as well. Nature Conservancy always need volunteers. We always need volunteers at Hong Kong News, so please do get in contact.